Welcome to the Phil Lewis podcast. Anybody who leads a business will know that sometimes the pressures can feel overwhelming. And a really interesting question for those of us at those times is, where do we turn to cope? In this month's episode, I am joined by a remarkable leader, Simon Farrell, who tells us the story of how he started to use alcohol and where it led him. And not only the impact on his business, but actually the impact on his life that in time that particular coping strategy had. There is a huge amount in this episode for anybody who not only might be questioning their relationship with alcohol, but might actually be struggling to think about and process how they deal with the pressure that they're under as well. In the second half of the episode, I'm joined by another coach, the brilliant Krish Surroy, to examine some of the wider lessons from Simon's story. But for now, let's get into the conversation. It's a moving one, and I think you'll find a lot of value in it. Simon, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Phil. Thank you for having me.
Always the first question I ask. So what story have you got for us about your career, your life? What has you here?
Well, I guess my story is one of not coping very well with pressure and pressure of being a leader of a business, choosing to deal with that pressure in a not very healthy way, which ended in disaster. And then my journey out of that into a new reality in some ways, which sounds a bit grand, but yeah, the path that I've found or was introduced to me has just opened up a whole new realm of being, really. So that in a nutshell, that's what my story is, I think.
Well, let's start with a horrible sense of pressure and what was going on there. So give us a sense of when and where and how all that was showing up for you.
Yeah, so I came to Scotland in 2005, and I married a Scottish girl, and we were living in Manchester. We just had our first child, and she was really keen to come to Scotland. So we moved up to Scotland in 2005, and I was lucky enough to get an opportunity to buy into a design consultancy, brand consultancy here in Edinburgh. And so it was relatively big. It was about 55 people. I bought 10% off the founder who was moving on, and got stuck into running the business. It was the first time I'd run a business. Up until then, I'd been like a strategy guy, and the business at that time wasn't doing as well as I thought it would. And so coming into a creative business, thinking I'm the strategy guy, then confronted with things like redundancies and cost cutting, I found really difficult.
So you'd kind of put your happy ears on during the buying in process.
I had completely missed the whole point of due diligence. I was just very excited to get to the opportunity to work, to own a business or co-own a business, be managing director in Scotland, and I thought everybody's happy. And I didn't really dig into the nuts and bolts of the financials as much as I should have done. So that was on me. But anyway, it turned it around, and over the course of 10, 12 years, actually became a very successful business. You know, we had 11 years of profit growth, won lots of awards. We were ranked in the top 5, actually, for creativity and for effectiveness in the UK. So from nowhere, you know, really doing well, working with, you know, Standard Life, RBS, did all the, I don't know if you've seen the People Make Glasgow brand, that was me. British Council, so lots of big brands doing really, really well. And so from the outside, everything looked perfect, but I was struggling with that. I didn't really cope very well with the pressure of maintaining that growth, you know, keeping the reputation going year after year. And in that sort of creative industry, it's very much, you know, project driven, new clients, lots of pitching. It was.
Well, it becomes a beast to feed, doesn't it? I mean, I started in the advertising and marketing industry as well, running strategy too. And you know, you get to a size of business where, I don't know, 40, 50, 60 people, we can litigate precisely how many, but you get to a point where it just becomes a big old beast. And you also realise sometimes in those businesses that they're not actually full of great salespeople either. So the pressure that starts to come upwards can be really considerable.
Yeah, it was like at the time. So this is going back like 2015 time. I think the wage bill was about 180 grand a month something like that. So we had to make 180 grand, 200 to basically to break even.
Just to stand still.
Yeah, and if like 70% or 60% of that is coming from new business wins, and you can imagine the average client was about 20, 30 grand or something. You can see how much pressure that
that's relentless.
Yeah.
Actually.
So I didn't cope very well with that pressure, and because success was everything for me. I wanted to be a successful person. I wanted to be that managing director, that co-owner of a successful business that was winning awards, and so that pressure was all put on by myself. Really, it wasn't. It wasn't. Obviously, there was the making a profit and making payroll and all those were there. There were external pressures, but I think as I've reflected on my journey, I think a lot of it was me, wanting to succeed and pushing myself and not coping very well with the pressure and stress, and choosing to deal with that with alcohol. And what started out as just like maybe 1 or 2 drinks after work, just to take the edge off before going home, because by this time I was at home with the wife, had 4 children, so 4 children at home, working there, and it was that
young children as well, presumably.
Well, yeah. So the oldest was born in 2003, the youngest in 2010. So in 25, they were between 5 and 12, something like that. So yeah, all school age, all pretty full on. And yeah, so apparently the French have got this saying, which is 5 et 7, which is this 5 till 7, which is where you go to the pub or go to the bar to have a few wines, what have you. And so I used to do that most nights. But then I as these things do, or certainly with me, the more I sort of relied on alcohol to take away the anxiety, the more the anxiety came back. And obviously it just got worse and worse and worse. And so in 2016, I was pretty much drinking from 7 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night, just to stay steady. And you'd think that drinking that amount of alcohol day in, day out, people would say you've got a drink problem, but I just hid it so well.
And how are you masking that in the context of, because you're running a busy business, you're going and doing new business meetings, all the rest of it. How were you making sure that level of alcohol consumption just wasn't being detected by clients, by people around you?
Well, just very sneaky. I mean, the need for alcohol. By that time, I was dependent.
Yeah, you'd be physically dependent.
Yeah, so I would be waking up shaking, and so I had there's boxes of wines. You take the bag out of the box. Had those under my bed and have a slug of wine, like 7, just to steady the nerves. And then go to the pub on the way to work. There's places in Edinburgh that are open before 9 o'clock, a couple of pints there, and at lunchtime little bottles of wine in my pocket, go to the toilet. So all these little sneaky things and lots of mints, just trying to hide the smell. So it was just a case of managing myself so I wasn't shaking, but not too much that I would fall over.
That sounds like an unbelievably lonely place to be, as much as anything else. I mean, was anybody in your life aware of the amount that you were drinking at that time? So literally, this is a secret as well that you're carrying alongside all the pressure and everything else.
Yeah, because a huge shame. There's huge, because at that stage, so in 2015, 2016, I knew I had a bad drink problem, and I knew I had to do something about it, but I couldn't. So, if you're in addiction, if you're addicted to something as badly as I was, it is your lifeline. It's the only way you know how to deal with life. So if you take that away from me, I'm shaking, I panic. It's like taking air away from somebody. That's the way it felt to me.
Well, there's the emotional there's the physical dependency, which is its own thing medically, isn't it? Biologically,
yes,
whatever.
Yeah.
But the thing that triggers all that in the first place is the emotional dependency, which is I'm not coping with what the world is throwing at me at the moment, and therefore I need to try and find some sort of means of being able to address that and deal with that.
Absolutely. And as I was to learn later on, and through my recovery, it's actually a threefold thing. There's a physical, there's the mental and emotional, but also the spiritual, in terms of, because what was really going on was that there was just something missing in here, which I didn't know what it was. I thought I could fill that something with work or nice houses, nice cars, all the things that I was striving for, success, reputation, but that wasn't filling that hole in the heart, in the soul.
There's a really beautiful David Foster Wallace story called This Is Water.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things he talks about in This Is Water is the fact that he says there's no such thing as an atheist.
Right.
Every adult is worshipping someone or something, and you have to be very careful what you worship, which is that you can meditate on this for a very, very long time. And he talks about the worship of money, the worship of success, the worship of the body, whatever it is, you know, and how actually as adults we're all making choices. And what I hear in your story is, you know, and it resonates with my own in some ways as well, is there's a kind of hole or a need that you're going, well, if I'm successful business owner, what does successful business owner actually mean? Maybe that's not well enough defined anyway. You're just going to go, well, maybe I'll be rich and successful and people will see me leading this business and I have all these awards and I have this team that thinks I'm doing a wonderful job. And the thing I've observed over years, and I don't know if this is true for you, but the thing I've observed over years is it's like that hole's never going to get filled. No. It's like however much you pour into it, however much you satisfy all that stuff, it's just never, ever going to be getting filled because it's just not going to be able to give that to you. And that spiritual dimension that you're talking about is just not going to be filled by things like money and success, however they're defined, you know.
Funnily enough, I use that quote in my book. And the end of that quote is, we all worship something. And a very good reason to choose God is that everything else that you worship will pretty much eat you alive. And so, and that was my truth, you know, I think. And it's interesting you talk about success because, so one of the things I've started to talk about in my work, helping other people through this, you know, similar situations, not just addiction, but just struggling with pressure, is this idea of authentic success, you know, because I think there's a narrative within our culture, certainly for people going into business and certain of people of a certain age like me, us, where, you know, success is laid out for you for a very early age. You know, success at school is grades. You know, my kids are just doing prelims at the moment. The pressure on them to do well, to get 100%. Good grades, to go to university. And it was the same for me. I was, you know, going to school, get good grades, go to university. I did business studies at university to get a good job on the milk round, work for Scottish and Newcastle, Heineken. They sent me off to Warwick Business School. This is what success looks like. This is how you're a successful business person. And all the metrics are pretty much profit, growth, market share, continual growth. And that's what I thought. You know, so when I go into running this business, my version of success is all those metrics. But what I didn't do, again, looking back at this, I had my identity so tied up with the identity of the business that my success was totally tied in with the success of the business. And so all I knew was make that business more profitable, grow, make it more reputation. That means that I would get more money, that would grow. And that's what I worshipped, work and financial success for the business.
So take us back then to, I've got this sort of mental image in my head, which, you know, find really sad actually, which is you, and I mean sad and genuine, like it sits heavily with me, of you, you know, with bottles of wine under the bed and calling into a pub on the way to work in the morning, knowing a little bit about addiction in the way that I do. This cannot be not showing up in your work and in your relationships in your life. So give us a sense then of what started to happen for you around that time.
So at the end of 2015, I actually had to take time out, and because it was my nerves. It's because, well, obviously I was shaking in the morning, but when I didn't drink, I got incredibly anxious. So things that I used to do all the time, really naturally, like, you know, facilitate workshops, I found those incredibly stressful. Sure. My outlook on life was becoming increasingly negative. So I thought that, you know, we're not going to win that pitch. We're not going to do this. Used to get very short and angry with people, with the kids, you know. So all those were the signs, and I knew I had to take time out. Took time out at the end of 2015. Took 3 months off work, and it was then that I told my wife. I said, "Look, I've got a drink problem." and I'm going to stop. It was this time in actually 2015. So coming up to 10 years ago. It was just before Christmas, and I said, I'm going to go through Christmas. I'm going to drink, as normal, but in January, that's it. I'm going to stop. And then
it must have been a very difficult conversation.
It was, but interestingly, my wife said, you're not an alcoholic, because I actually said those words. I said, I'm an alcoholic.
Right.
And she goes, you're not an alcoholic. You do drink a bit too much, but you're not an alcoholic. Thinking that an alcoholic is someone, on the bench with a bottle of, in the brown paper bag or whatever, not the managing director of a business that looks on the outside to have it all.
Really well.
Yeah. And again, myself, and I know, because talking to other people in recovery and addiction, we are very good at hiding our addictions, very good. And so it was tough. And but I stopped drinking. But then 2016 was just a disaster. It was a story of me trying to stop and not being able to stop. And so I started going to like 12-step meetings and things like this, and recovery groups, and everybody said to me, well, what you need to do, you need to stop drinking, obviously. You need to get a sponsor and go through these 12 steps, this 12-step program of recovery, which is pretty well known in recovery circles. And but it has words like God and higher power, and it's this spiritual nature. And I just said, that's a load of rubbish. It's not for me. It's fine. I just don't drink. I just won't drink. But obviously at that time, I didn't know that this hole that I had here, which was the spiritual hole, this sort of something missing. If I wasn't filling that with something other than work or money or booze or whatever, it was still going to get me. And so throughout 2016, I went to rehab twice. Didn't get the message.
And how are things going in the business around this time?
Well, I was just in and out. I was a liability. I was a complete liability. The guys that I was co-owner with, Malcolm and Richard, were amazingly supportive. All the way. You
talked to them about the fact that you had this problem as well.
They pulled me up on it. I didn't have the strength or the courage to tell them. I tried to hide it, and then it became obvious throughout 2016. It was obvious what was to the people at work, because the smelling and just going to the toilets to top up and shaking, and so they said, look, you just need to get yourself sorted. So they were really supportive, supported me out throughout that year, but I just couldn't get it, couldn't stop drinking, and then at the end of 2016 came out of rehab again, and that's when they said, look, Simon, it's enough is enough. We've worked with you for a year, and we can't carry on this. And at the time, I was amazingly resentful. I said, "How dare you? How dare you do that to me? I'm the managing director. I brought you up to this position. I gave you shares. I put you on the board. All this," and I just thought that it's not fair. And off I went. But that was it. We had equal shares. So, I was out of the business. So I felt very, very hard done to at that point. But I did stop drinking. I'd stopped drinking. But actually, those parts of the 12-step program is making amends. So step 9 is actually make amends.
Notoriously one of the toughest and most valuable parts of the program.
Exactly. Yeah. And you, in step 4, you go through all your fears and harms and resentments and what have you. Step 5, you share with them. Step 6 and 7, you start turning your life around. And step 8, you make a list of all the people you've either harmed or hold strong resentments against. And my 2 co-owners were numbers 1 and 2. And so 3 years after I'd been kicked out, I went back and apologized, because what the program did, what they was able to see, is that they didn't kick me out. I forced them. I put them into a position. My role was that I was in and out of rehab and drinking all that year. They didn't want me to be that sort of person.
One of the things about adult life is, two opposing things can be true at the same time. And one of the great paradoxes is behaviours we see in others that deserve both deep and endless compassion and a complete accountability.
Absolutely, yeah.
And addiction, I think, is the kind of pinnacle of that in a way. like addicts deserve extraordinarily levels of compassion because there is just such pain being worked out through addiction. At the same time, there has to be accountability for behavior as well. And that's the route to healing and growth and all of those sorts of things. I think it's incredibly hard to be able to, and as somebody who's had friends and family go through addiction myself and all that, it's a huge dilemma. I think, how do you navigate through that compassion and accountability binary? I think it's very, very hard to do well.
It is, and I didn't appreciate that at the time. You know, I was still very selfish.
You're
and
in your own pain,
self-centered.
of course. Yeah.
You know, you don't understand what it's like to be me. I'd try my hardest, and at that point, I wasn't drinking, but it was absolutely the right thing for them and me. You know that tough love thing, accountability, the consequences of your actions. So that was me out and feeling very hurt and raw and trying to then find my way through life without alcohol. But what was interesting at that point was I was still not doing the 12 steps. I was just not drinking. And so really on edge, you know, I'm not drinking. I'll show you type thing. It was very much that I will show you what I'm made of. I'm going to make something of myself. So that all those same behaviors came back. I hadn't dealt with them.
The same drive and determination, probably, that had you build the business as well. It's all those sorts of things show up as well, I imagine.
Yeah. And I was still thinking in my mind, success. I want to be success, business success.
Yeah, okay.
You know, go back. I'll do it on my own. I'll start again. I'll build something. I'll get my reputation back. All those sorts of things, and I just didn't realize what was going on inside here. Hadn't taken the time to reflect on why I was drinking. It just occurred to me that the problem was drink. So, you know, in my mind, I'm drinking too much. That's the problem. But actually, drinking was the solution to my problem. The problem was I couldn't cope with life, and so throughout 2016, 17, I was on that very angst-driven drive to prove myself again. And then, 18 months into that journey, my wife was diagnosed with cancer, and then she passed away in 6 weeks after 6 months, and that was like it was as quick as that. It was shocking. So four kids, you know, without a job. And then I started drinking again. I didn't know how to deal with anything other than alcohol. It was the only thing I knew that could deal with any sort of pressure, stress, pain, or what have you. And so for the next 7 months, that was pure chaos. Or not chaos. It was just lost. I was completely lost. I didn't know what to do, how to cope.
Grief is its own unique and grueling journey in and of itself, and alcohol will not make it better.
No. So it just bottling, just ignoring those feelings, just numbing them. And you know, and again, I think one of the things I've come to learn is that numbing effect was probably what I found so relieving with alcohol all those years. It was I couldn't cope with the stress or the pressure or what was going on with life, and so the alcohol just numbed everything. And I think what you find is but it numbs everything. It's not just the bad feelings, all the good feelings. And so you find it very hard to enjoy the little things of life. You know, the kids playing football or netball, or you just lose all joy of life. But anyway, after about 7 months, I just, you know, I knew I couldn't. As always, I always knew I can't drink, you know, like other people. I can't drink safely. I use it in a dangerous way. So I went back into rehab for a third time. And that's when I said, right, fine. I know you've told me about these 12 steps before now. I'll do them. If that's what it takes, I'll do it. And so
that's the moment of surrender on which all recovery actually depends. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And the people talk about rock bottom.
Yeah.
You'd have thought, you know, getting kicked out of your business or, you know, trying to deal with life in that. You'd have thought that would have been my rock bottom, but it wasn't. It was that complete surrender. I have no idea how to deal with this. I've tried. I can't. I'm over to you. So that's when I started going through the 12-step program with my sponsor guy. And I used to go to his house once a week and go to meetings 3 or 4 times. And he was a very spiritual guy. And I was lucky, with all these things in life. You look back and go, wasn't I lucky to meet that person or that person? And I just happened to meet this guy in a meeting, and I said, will you help me go through the steps? He said, yeah. And he was a really spiritual guy, and he said, right, what I need you to do is I want you to start praying every day. I want you to meditate every day. I want you to read spiritual books every day. And I said, well, what's that? Why? I don't understand. Just do it. And so I was doing these things and trying to conceive. And one of the genius things about the 12-step program is it talks about a God of your understanding. And so I've never been a religious person. I think that's one of the reasons why I was so put off by it, because I didn't relate to God. It wasn't that I had a bad thing against religion. It just didn't mean anything to me. It felt irrelevant. But the genius is it's a God of your understanding. And as soon as you start trying to pray for a God of your understanding that you don't understand, and you have no idea what it is, you start, well, what is it? What is this thing? What is this thing, a higher power? What could they mean that they're asking me to do this for? And so, you talked about I'm, strategy, but guy like yourself, I'm quite curious. And so there's something sparked into me, which is like, what can they mean here? What could it be?
Yeah.
And how is this going to help? And so alongside doing the 12-step program, and I'm doing those practices diligently every single day, because about that complete surrender, I'm doing it every day, going to meetings 4 times a week, getting babysitters so I can go to the meetings, and exploring other spiritual, trying reading around, well, what do the Christians mean by God? Or what about Buddhism? Do they have a God, and why not? And what do they believe? Or the ancient Chinese wisdoms, all these sorts of things, trying to piece things together. And but actually, so slowly, but what happened was, after about 7 months, I woke up one morning and I just felt like this huge weight has been lifted. It was like this, and in the 12-step circles, you talk about a spiritual awakening. It felt like that. It was like waking up to reality for the first time and feeling just incredibly peaceful. And just, and a lot of that low-lying, unspoken, undescribable dread that I think sat with me for many years, like this low-lying anxiety, had gone. I just didn't have it anymore, and I found that incredible. And it was, and as part of that program, I went to, when I was at rehab. Up until that point, I was taking antidepressants and everything, and they recommended I stop all that. So I'm not here to say whether you should or shouldn't, but they told me I should.
You also, one of the reasons that we're talking on this podcast, you posted a remarkable thing on LinkedIn, I thought, about forgiveness, which I was like, very occasionally you sort of trawl through the kind of sewer of LinkedIn. We may not put that in the edit. Actually, we should put it in the edit. Very occasionally you trawl through the sewer of LinkedIn and you sort of see a bit of a diamond, whatever. And I was like, forgiveness is one of those words that we don't really hear in business at all. And yet my observation about organizational life is it's full of hurt, it's full of anger, it's full of people who are not able to process what they're going through. We'll talk about all that momentarily, I think. But I wanted just to bring the story back to where you went in the end, because your story of forgiveness really has a remarkable outcome in terms of your ex-business partners and what you've then gone on to do in your life since. So tell us about that.
So that whole going back into to see Malcolm and Richard, to take responsibility for my actions and my drinking and make amends, which was back in 2020, sort of reformed that bond with those guys, and through this forgiveness. And it was a really moving moment for all of us, because I think we all realized it was a situation nobody wanted, and they forgave me for the pain that I put them through, and obviously I forgave them again they did the right thing, so there was nothing really to forgive, but I let go of that resentment, and
well, you did have to forgive them though. I mean, you're carrying the resentment.
Yes.
You had to let that go.
Yeah,
forgiveness is to look beyond, isn't it?
Yeah,
so
yes, that's true.
You let that go.
Well, interesting actually, I suppose the biggest forgiveness was to myself. I forgave myself.
Yeah.
Because I rather than carrying the guilt and shame of what I did to them, it's like it was a situation that I chose wrongly. I acted wrongly. It had a negative impact. I take responsibility for that, and I'm making my best to make amends, so I can forgive myself. So that was probably the biggest forgiveness in that circle. But anyway, so this whole journey of spiritual impact actually was then something that because I relate my story goes back to business and me running that business, and how I saw the impact of my leadership, or the role of leadership on me, and the impact that spirituality, and you talked about forgiveness isn't talked about in business circles. The whole spiritual process isn't talked about in business circles. And I thought, well, why not? Why isn't that? Because if I had known some of the things back then, I may have not gone through all that pain. I may not have caused all the pain that I did to my family, to the people at work. And so I started thinking, well, what might spirituality look like in a business context, and particularly for leaders? Because again, I think this idea that I think we put ourselves under pressure as business leaders to succeed, because that's the narrative that we've got around us from a business context, and we also associate our own self-worth with the success of the business that we're leading. So there's a whole identity thing, and we tend not to think about, well, what does success look like for me as a human being, and tend not to invest in ourselves, because we're investing so much in the business success. And so I was quite keen to explore what might a more spiritual approach look like for leaders if we could open up some of these discussions and people could find something to worship other than their business and their work and the profitability. And so, and while I was mulling this over, and I wrote the book that has sort of alludes to that, I was meeting up with Richard, who was my co-owner at the business, and I'm just chatting that over. And he had gone through a similar journey. It was a different journey. It wasn't one of addiction or the 12-step program, but a similar journey of really struggling with, after I left, with some of the issues that were dogging the company, and going through his own turmoil, and finding a route out of that, which was more spiritual. And so we started talking about this and saying, well, why did we have to go through so much pain? And again, I think there is an argument that some pain is necessary to get you to that point. But so we just started exploring the idea, and it's just this summer actually, of maybe putting together a program for leaders which would explore some of these things. So I'm keen not to say this is what you should do or this is what you shouldn't do, but just as...
It's inquiry, isn't it? I mean, the interesting thing, I was round out on a couple of things here. I mean, firstly, that word spirituality often brings with it kind of associations of, hippy dippy woo woo shit, that we all need to be sort of sat with our legs crossed, omming. And it's not really about that at all. I think the way that you describe it, the way that I would interpret it, it's more about just that connection to what's really going on deep within us, and questions like, what are we actually putting on pedestals in our life? What are we worshipping in the language we've been using over the course of this recording? And those sorts of questions are actually fundamental. The other thing I just wanted to round back with you on, just get your reflections on. One of the things I think it could be easy to think if you're listening to this conversation, Simon, is that, you went through a dreadful time. I mean, clearly a really, really dreadful experience there. And my heart goes out to you. I find it very moving listening to your story. And it can be tempting sometimes to your wife's point about you're not an alcoholic. That I find myself reflecting as we were talking about the fact that to a point we can all struggle with these kind of things to greater or lesser extents, can't we? That you don't have to be shaking in the morning to have a kind of some sort of emotional dependency on alcohol, for example. You don't have to be going bankrupt time and time again because you're overspending, because you're in pursuit of, you think money's going to make you happy or whatever it is, And actually, so many people who are leading businesses who are suffering from loneliness, suffering from pressure, are sublimating what's going on for them in all sorts of ways, and not necessarily in ways that were as pronounced as you ultimately have described in this conversation. But I just wanted to get your reflections on that, because, there is the thing in the 12 steps of you probably do need to reach rock bottom ultimately if you've got really chronic addiction before you will seek help. But I think what you're offering in your new program and what we've been talking about this afternoon, there's an opportunity to reach people who maybe not at that level of extreme yet, or indeed at all, but are still aware that they are sublimating something that would be better dealt with in healthier ways.
Absolutely. And I think the telltale signs for me are distraction and numbing. I talked about numbing earlier. Because again, and I don't like blaming society, but I just see it. I see a lot of it, having gone through the journey that I have gone through. So one of the things that I don't do now, so I've not had a drop of alcohol for 6.5 years, no drugs or anything like that. So when you're forced with difficult situations, you have to deal with those emotions, those feelings, and it's become obvious to me that I can then deal with those emotions through scrolling or chocolate, or and they, oh gosh, that's me moving away from what's going on inside. And so I think one of the things I'm keen to promote to people is that just be mindful of those behaviors, because and what we're trying to do in the program is look inside. There's actually Gabor Mate, I don't know if you've heard. Yeah. So he's written a really good book called The Myth of Normal.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book.
You read
very, very empathic, beautiful book.
Yeah. And he talks about addiction as almost like as a spectrum on that front. So in that book, he talks about this awakening as waking up to what is real in and around us, and I love that sentiment, and almost that gets to the heart of the spiritual solution. So when you wake up to what is real inside, you're waking up to the emotions that are going through you and the triggers that cause those emotions. So and sitting with them and dwelling on them and thinking, well, why is that causing me this emotion? And doing that through introspection. And then the stories and what is real around us are the triggers, are the stories that we listen to that cause those emotions. So, again, going back to my own story, is that as a leader, I was listening to a story that was this is what business success looks like. That was just a story. But I chose to believe that story. I didn't realize it was a story, as the story of capitalism, or whatever you want to call it. It's like, but it's a story that was indoctrinated to me again and again and again through business school and university and all these things and business press. And I didn't realize that there could be an alternative way of conceiving of success, which wasn't that narrative. And so through this program, I really want to open that up and have that group. The way we've structured it is, firstly, it's okay to talk about spiritual things in business. So that's the first thing. So there's a sense of belonging and having an open discussion. And then exploring ideas that might help us open up to what is real within us and around us, and what are the narratives that we're listening to, that we're choosing to believe, and are there alternative narratives?
I've been sober myself now for, I think, somewhere between 4 and 5 years.
All right, well done.
And one of the things that is very challenging about being sober is coming up close with the emotions that we experience. And life is much more extreme sports when you have no numbing agents for it, I think is absolutely right.
But isn't that a gift?
And it is, but it takes some acclimatization, I think, and it takes some support. And I'm really glad that you're doing the work that you're doing. Just wanted to mention your book here, which we'll put on camera, The Habits of Happiness, which you wrote, I think, a couple of years ago, didn't you?
Yeah. It took me about a year to write. I felt a real compulsion to write it. It was, I think, a process of me trying to make sense of the journey that we've just talked about. And, you know, all these books that I'd read and all, the different spiritual traditions and how I was so against spirituality to start with, and the concept of God, and how those had an amazing impact on my experience of life. And just thinking, I just needed to make sense of it.
I was really keen to get you on this podcast because I don't hear many people who are as open, especially as someone who's been in the advertising and marketing industry, and who's been a business owner, has been as open as you've been about your struggles with addiction and actually your transcendence of that in the end, which I think is a really inspiring story. From a personal point of view, it's been really moving to listen to that today and to learn from you as we've done that. And I think listeners to this podcast will find tremendous value in reflecting perhaps on some of the insights that you've shared. So I just wanted to thank you for your openness and generosity in sharing your story. I think it will really make a difference.
Oh, no, thanks. It's been great. Great talking to you.
When I started to think about who it is I wanted to sit with to process some of the lessons from that story, there was a very, very short list of coaches that came to mind. And at the top of it was Krish Surroy. Krish and I have known each other for years, and he is one of the kindest, most empathic, and frankly, most enlightened coaches I know. A master coach, he specialises in going very deep to help leaders wrestle with some really quite uncomfortable stuff. And so it proves here, where we sit together and examine what leaders of all different types, in all different types of organisations as well, can take from Simon's story. Here's my conversation with Krish. Krish, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here, Phil. Thanks for having me.
I don't know what your reaction to that story in the first half was, but I mean, I was sat there in the studio recording it with Simon and I was quite moved by it. And it brought up a lot for me, and may end up sort of sharing some of that as this conversation goes on. But I guess where I wanted to start was when you listened back, what was your own response to that story?
I think there are, on a couple of levels. First of all, just a lot of personal connection with it. It's a story that feels, in some ways, very, personal to me, and I can relate to it. There was a lot of relatability to my own story, both in terms of recovery, but also the spiritual aspect. And I think, very often in business, it's something we don't talk about it, do we? So I thought it was really kind of courageous of Simon to speak about it. But I think the other layer in which I kind of heard it, or what came out for me, was, as a coach and as consultant, so many of the leaders I work with are sort of under these kinds of pressures. And the kind of things that Simon was talking about, I think they're so rife through business, but they just get squished underneath. And I thought there was the word that just kept on coming to me was courage, to be able to, articulate a journey that I think so many people go through, but not many people are super open about because it's so taboo in our society, as it were.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, the thing I found myself reflecting on afterwards, and I did this to a point with Simon as well, was there's a danger, I think, innately of looking at a story like that as though it's a total edge case, as though in the end, he was suffering from really quite severe alcoholism by the time that he checked himself into rehab, not just once, twice, 3 times, and also went through some really harrowing personal experiences as well alongside all of that. And because it's like a lot of stories of people who've been through real depths of addiction, it can feel like a very extreme story. I almost felt that the danger in a story like that is that we don't do the work to try and relate to it.
Right.
And I personally, I gave up drinking a few years ago, but aside from like specifics of alcohol or specifics of anything else, what it really prompted for me was a reflection around what are your coping strategies, and what coping strategies are you seeing in the leaders that you work with, and how healthy are those coping strategies? Because we all have them. We all have to have them.
Right.
The world requires us to wear armor, but it also requires us to be able to deal with the various stresses and strains and everything else that it's going to throw at us just in the course of everyday life.
So many of those coping strategies we have, we kind of don't frame in like addiction, right? Whether it's kind of workaholism, whether it's kind of like I've had my own journey in 12-step around food. That's been my thing. And the thing about food is, unlike alcohol, you can't just give up food and, but there are so many things we have and anything, there's that old phrase, isn't there? Everything in moderation. Well, when addiction's concerned, there is no moderation. It's just, but there are so many things that we use as coping strategies, certainly in the Western world, that we wouldn't even kind of label as addiction. But the thing that also strikes me though, Phil, is, and I think this says much more about, the world of business and the world of, Western commerce, is what causes us need those coping strategies to that degree as well. Whether it's protection, whether it's armor, whether it's kind of like, and when I think about some of the behaviors I see in organizations, it's, somewhat less than human, shall we say. There's so much ego and there's so much power play and, it's all those things where if we were just able to have, real conversations in the workplace and we weren't dealing with people's own, judge and victim talking to each other and that kind of stuff, would we have the need for some of those coping strategies in the first place, kind of thing?
I think that's right. I'm I did some work in Canary Wharf, so I was working with a fast food company and when you work with this particular fast food company, you have to go and stand behind the counter and work in the restaurants for a few days. It's kind of how you earn the credibility to do that. And you're laughing because you know me and you'll therefore know just how unnaturally that kind of, shall we say,
I've also been there myself as well.
Yeah. And you're just like, you learn a lot though, right? And there is sort of two things, spending a few days in Canary Wharf, there were two things that it got me thinking about, which are relevant to what you said. I mean, firstly, Canary Wharf sort of struck me, and this is going to sound quite value judgment-like, but it sort of struck me as the hedonic treadmill in action, right? So in other words, you earn the money in the high-rise offices, and then you go down and spend it in the jewellers under the shopping centre that's kind of been built to take your bonus off you, right? And therefore that is 100%. And that is literally the hedonic treadmill in action, The hedonic treadmill, by the way, for listeners who haven't come across it, is the idea that we effectively enslave ourselves to needing to earn with the selves that we then buy for ourselves as a means of both reward and soothing ourselves because we've gone through the pain and the process of having to earn the money in the first place, and it kind of perpetuates. But the other thing that really struck me was, of all the places that I went and worked behind the counters in those restaurants, Canary Wharf was the most challenging because actually the people there seemed unhappier than almost anywhere else, right? Very highly paid, very, very unhappy. And it was a really interesting sort of thing. And I'm not a perfect soul, you know what I mean? So I shall we say, had a response to it, which is going to be less kind of erudite than the one I'm about to give you maybe. But the response I had to it was, when I reflected on it afterwards, was, God, what a lot of misery there seems to be in this hole under the ground, which is filled with all these jewelry shops, and how unbelievably rude you are to one another. And again, it's like, so coping strategies there, end up being spending money, for example. They end up being about performative signals of success, but also there's a kind of psychological lostness to a lot of what I saw in that environment, where people had basically kind of, they were clearly, for whatever reason, incredibly unhappy. And I think, to your point then, what we've got is an environment that's both incentivizing and perpetuating in the world of work a lot of the time situations in which people need coping strategies, but actually those coping strategies aren't working either and only making us all a bit more miserable, which is kind of what Simon's story, I think, again, as an edge case, illustrates perfectly, really.
Yeah, well, as you said, they're coping strategies. They're not thriving strategies.
Yes, yeah, good distinction.
And there's a thing there, isn't there? I mean, it might be a bit, hackneyed, but there's that old thing that, and this is sort of me paraphrasing, major tenets of Buddhism and like butchering them, but that whole notion that in the West we do stuff. We do things like jobs that fundamentally probably aren't aligned with who we are as people, or they actually go so far as to make us really unhappy in order to have the big paycheck, in order to have the house, the car, the stuff, because we're told that that's what will make us be happy or be fulfilled. And this is kind of what Simon was saying, this kind of notion of, extrinsic success, what we're told will be success is so extrinsic, it's not intrinsic to who we are. And of course the notion from, I say Buddhism, but several Eastern philosophies is if you take care of your being first, your state of being, we all have those emotions in us, happiness, sadness, pain, joy, whatever. If you take care of that first, then you end up doing things that are much more aligned with who you are, and therefore probably self-fulfilling and making you happier or more purpose-driven, or all of those things. But
it's a beautiful distinction, isn't it? I mean, you've mentioned on a few, even just in the few minutes we've been talking, you mentioned the West quite a few times, and then started to drive some distinctions with the East. And what I heard in what you just said was this distinction between doing as a means of fulfillment, as opposed to being, attending to being as a means of fulfillment. And I wondered if you could just talk more to that, because or actually correct my interpretation if I'm wrong there, but elucidate more that West versus East difference for us, because it sounds very interesting.
Well, I mean, again, it's not exactly as distinct as I'm making it sound, no more than the whole left brain right brain distinction or anything like that. But the notion being that a lot of the Eastern philosophies, whether that's Buddhism, Taoism, Shinto, Hinduism, are much more based in states of consciousness and much more based in who we are being inside ourselves. So in coaching, we talk about like coaching at the level of who, of identity. So that notion that if we do practices, or even if we just attend to getting to know who we truly are inside, what drives us, our strengths, our motivations, our gifts, and that's the place we come from, then we make choices and we take actions that are more aligned with that. And so we're in alignment with who we are. We're not wasting time and energy trying to be something we're not. There are so much research that says that actually happiness levels tend to be much higher in countries that don't have lots of money than in countries that do, because we equate money with happiness in the West.
Again, this really resonated with me personally, and Simon's story is this, yes, there's a kind of worship of money and success and everything else going on there. But what that's really also connected to is I think on what you're talking about there, in that sense of wealth doesn't buy you happiness stuff, is there's a kind of intrinsic lack, right? There's a sense of lack. There's a sense of actually, in the end, if I achieve a certain level of success, if I achieve a certain level of wealth, if I achieve a certain level of renown, if I achieve a certain level of prestige amongst my peers, whatever it's going to be, then ultimately that internal lack is going to get filled. Now, the challenge, it seems to me, with that is the fact that catalyst, if you will, and it is a kind of catalyst, or it's a drive, if you want to call it that, can produce real positives in people's lives. So personally, as somebody who's probably bordered on workaholic for 20 years on and off, my immense sense of drive, which comes from some of that and comes from some other places as well, has actually brought some very, very good things into my life.
Right.
It's also brought some really problematic things into my life. And again, so the story that Simon was sharing with us, I think actually he obviously ended up in an incredibly unhealthy place with it, connected back spiritually, and has now found a much, well, not only healthy sense of balance, but actually is doing some wonderfully worthwhile work around leadership and everything else off that. But I think, again, the interesting thing is the sort of yin and yang thing, isn't it? Of like, where are the things that drive us? Where do they serve us? Where do they not? Where are they healthy? Where are they unhealthy? Where do we have to check the fact that unhealthy things can sometimes have positive outcomes? All that sort of stuff's very present, I felt, in that story as well.
100%. I mean, Simon talked a lot, didn't he, about the hole inside, and like even when he was on his journey before kind of doing the steps of like, just I'm gonna not drink, it's like, well, you're dealing with the symptom there but not with the cause, which for him he described as that that emptiness. And I think another distinction I make from that kind of, I call it the East-West philosophy. I mean, it's not necessarily that per se, but it is that notion of extrinsic versus intrinsic, and that notion of so many more of the Eastern, and actually a lot of the indigenous kind of things like shamanic practice and that kind of thing, are drawn from deep contemplation, meditation, listening to the inside, and so therefore directly addressing and directly looking at that thing that could be the whole or whatever else, and everything else comes as within so without. Whereas I remember feeling, and this is like going back a long time, my very first job was I was an HR officer for a very large automotive in the UK that is no longer very large. And I was doing the CIPD with them, so the Institute of Personal Development. I remember one of the very first exercises was around the distinction between internal and external locus of control, and whether you're an introvert and an extrovert. Where is that locus of control? And at the time, because I was very extroverted, my locus of control was outside. And I thought that was a great thing, because I was all about people and a team player and all this kind of stuff. And I didn't realize what that was basically saying was the whole of my life is subject to external forces. It's subject to other people's opinions and all that. And it's taken me years to do the work to actually kind of go, you know what? That's in me now, and I can self-validate. And that doesn't mean I'm an island. That doesn't mean I don't care about what other people think or whatever, but it means that I'm much more in touch with who I am. And I think that's what we tend to lack in the West. We don't necessarily have that contemplative or that listening, that receptive thing, because it's such a dare I even say, masculine kind of culture that drives so much work. It's like, this with this thrust, this active thing. We've got to go out and make up. You even listen to the impact, seize the day, make an impact. It's very projective. And this ability to like just listen, receive, be still, be present. It's like, again, coming back to your notion of coping strategies, would we need them if we were much more grounded in ourselves and who we are?
Well, and also, I guess the other thing is if we didn't fear our feelings, which I think is a very human condition too, right? I mean, so we sublimate. So, we may turn to food, or we may turn to shopping or alcohol or sex or whatever else it is in our lives that are there as kind of, forces through which we try and sublimate this thing. Because the other thing I see a lot, and I recognize this again in myself, and I keep bringing myself into it, hopefully not through the lens of kind of narcissism, but just through the lens of actually, I want to kind of own it as well. I think in this conversation with you, is I recognize this kind of desire to not have to stop sometimes, because the stopping brings with it the fear of actually what might come into that space. Right. Years ago, I had a client. I don't think I've told this story before on this podcast, but it was one of the most memorable phone calls of my entire life. And I rang him. He was called Laurie. This is by the way, this is 20, I'm going to say 25 years ago, and it still stays with me. Right, it's very young in my career, at least younger than I am now. And I rang him. I said, Laurie, are you busy? Because we used to make phone calls in those days. It was like, you weren't emailing, you spontaneously phone call. Like, God, can you imagine?
Did you actually like ring the phone, dial it?
Literally, pick up the phone on your desk and make a call, 9 for an outside line, Anyway, and I said, Laurie, are you busy? And he's an old guy. And he went, not really, no. Now is more a time for reflection. And I still, to this day, think it's a beautiful thing to have said. And as the years have gone by, I think it's ever more a beautiful thing to have said, because I've never heard it from anybody else. It's like that journey into contemplation is really actually the journey of being, not doing, in what you were saying earlier on.
Absolutely,
and actually
right.
sitting in the unknown. I guess that's the value of coaching, at least in part, isn't it? Is to be able to create a safe space to do that kind of exploratory work and to have someone to do it with and all the rest of it. But I don't know if any of that resonates with you, but that sense of like, if I stop, what will be there is, I think, really, for me, it's very present. It's present for a lot of leaders I know as well, I think.
I think that's absolutely right. I think, we don't even often have the language for it, do we? This is why I love that Pixar film Inside Out, because, you come back to the 5 basic emotions. If ever, I mean, that should be Leadership 101 as far as I'm concerned, just the notion of being able to name our emotions and be present with them, let alone process them or anything like that. But it makes complete sense. And, something that occurs to me, and sorry, I'm going to go very deep here for a second, is so much of what I see, so much of the behavior I see in business is, reaction and all that kind of stuff. And often reaction to things like unhealed trauma and, past stuff of like, if you stop, it's going to come up. You either got to do the work or you sublimate it somehow. But sooner or later, even the sublimation doesn't really work, because we saw in Simon's story, it just all falls apart. I'm sure somewhere in this world there are, people who have been, living with addiction for a very long time. But certainly, every story I've seen, it's like sooner or later you have to turn and do the work, or you're going to self-destruct, kind of thing. And so I think so much of this is, it's damn scary to stop. And it's not even just feeling the feelings, it's then what comes after that. And I think so much of what I see is like unconscious or unhealed trauma in the workplace that necessitates this need to armor up, as we were talking about earlier. And that leads to, all the other stuff.
I met a really lovely guy a year or two ago who'd come to a particular seminar I was running, and I ended up having a follow-up conversation with him afterwards. And he said to me something that was so simple. I'd never thought of it this way, but it was sort of really profound as well. He said, dealing with the hurt in organizations is fundamentally about the most important job that leadership teams face, because hurt people can't think. And I thought, God, that's bang on, isn't it? Hurt people can't think. And it stayed with me for all the, since that conversation, because it's so true. When we are hurting, when we are in some degree of psychological or emotional pain,
absolutely,
we kind of can't see beyond the end of our own nose. We're often just managing that state. We can't think. We don't relate appropriately to one another. And then we think about all the kind of layers of compacted crud that there are in so many organizations in terms of unresolved conflict, negative experience, trauma, individually, collectively, all that kind of stuff. And all the hurt that goes with that doesn't get processed. And then what happens is that shows up consequentially, and it shows up in, human consequences, like maybe in the one that Simon was talking about. And we don't need to be alcoholics to be sublimating, as we've been talking about on this podcast so far, or whether it's actually in commercial consequences for an organization, because actually the organization isn't making good choices, or it's not doing the work it really needs to do, because actually people are so busy dealing with the hurt, or not dealing with the hurt, but kind of managing the pain, as it were, that actually in the end nothing goes anywhere fast. So I think your point's spot on, and it really is that thing around, if we don't deal with our pain, it will end up dealing with us. And again, Simon's story and his eventual transcendence actually through that journey, I think is a wonderful example of that,
I think so, absolutely. And the thing that really struck me about Simon's story, and exactly what you're talking about here, is, so often these stories, obviously they're wonderfully individual and human, but again, we don't exist as purely individual, do we? We're all within systems. So it kind of makes me wonder what was within Simon's system, like the family system, or, just the system that he lived within, that kind of also contributed to this. And talking about, the unresolved and unprocessed hurt in organizations, and I think that's bang on, absolutely. I don't know, have you ever had a chance to participate in something like an organizational constellation and constellation work?
Yeah. Amazing work, that.
I love it, and it's, this notion. I love even the story of where it came from. This German priest, I think in the 19th century, Bert Hellinger, observing, doing missionary work, and I think I've probably got this completely wrong, but I think it was the Natal Zulu he was observing. But this notion of how conflict was resolved was not just the two people, and even like the tribal chief, but the whole tribe came together. And there were not just the two people and the chief and the tribe, but, people were voicing, the ancestors, or voicing the emotions. So this notion of there are things in the system like hurt, anger, conflict, trauma. And the moment you give voice to them in the system, it helps the system itself to heal. It helps the system itself to resolve. And this is I think the power of kind of constellation work. It's not just, Simon in his individual story. He was in a system where, if we think about how he entered, okay, maybe due diligence was, something he felt he should do more of, but he entered into a system that was super pressured from the beginning, and then turned it around and begat more pressure and all this kind of stuff. So there are always this kind of systemic element that I think is the bit we often forget as well. And how do we work with the system? Because we can't always see the system, we can't personalize it. And I think as human beings, we tend to need to personalize things.
The question, I guess, around from an organizational standpoint is, can sublimation be done by organizations as well as people? Really interesting question, isn't it? And I mean, my feeling on it, I'd be interested in yours, but my feeling on it is yes. And if we look at classic responses to trauma, and some research has been done around organizational trauma, you see two states that organizations go into, being hyperarousal and hypoarousal. Hyperarousal being a kind of manic busy work, and if we see busy work as a kind of sublimation of a painful thing, as well as perhaps a sort of degree of hypervigilance, trying to make sure that the painful thing doesn't happen again. But busyness is a kind of antidote to not having to deal with a really difficult thing we don't actually want to talk about. And I think that would be one example. The other thing, and this is possibly slightly more controversial, but I was thinking about it, just come back from London a couple of days ago, and we're recording this episode in December. And shall we just say, watching some of the kind of collective, this is going to make me sound like a man who never gets invited to parties, but I am a man who never gets invited to parties. But I did find myself sort of watching some of the sort of very coked up and kind of boozy drinks that I was seeing going on, particularly in the city earlier on this week, thinking to myself, I wonder what's being avoided there as well. But that, as I say, that makes me sound like a Christmas party refusenick, which is not the message I want to send to listeners of this podcast.
I don't even think it's just a Christmas thing, Phil. We've both done work in the city, and also in creative and media as well. And Coke and booze are not just Christmas party things, are they? So maybe we never get invited to parties any time of year. I don't know. But there is that thing, isn't there, of like that physical need to use something to literally change the way we feel chemically. It's kind of a fascinating thing, and it is cultural to certain industries more than others, I think. I've done quite a lot of work in Silicon Valley over the years, and there, I'm not saying that those things don't exist, but just the sheer amount of workalism and presenteeism and virtue signaling around, I'm a founder who's doing 100 hours a week and all this kind of stuff, because we're, in hypergrowth and all that kind of stuff. And it becomes this badge of honor. So I think it's a different type of sublimation, but it's still an organizational sublimation, 100%. I think you're spot on there. I think at all levels, we can see the whole. We can see the coping strategy, we can see the sublimation, and we can probably see the work that needs to be done to come back to wholeness and transcend it.
That brings me back to the start, which is the point you made at the start around this word spiritual, which is such an interesting word, isn't it? Because it's not a word that we bring into business a lot.
Oh, I'm bringing it all the time now, Phil. I'm bringing it all the time.
I say we. I mean, maybe I was talking about the kind of... I was speaking on behalf of all people.
All consultants.
With a few exceptions, generally, it's not terminology that we are familiar with or comfortable with.
Right.
And I wanted to get your reflections on when we talk about being spiritual or the spirit. I wondered if it would be helpful to try and put some definitional sense around that, because actually I think it can, sound, and Simon talked about this in the context of the 12 steps, of course, but sound almost quasi-religious to people. And I don't believe it to be pointing in that direction at all.
Not at all, no.
But I'd love your take on it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thanks for asking. It's a great question. For me, spirituality, and again, the problem is slightly in the word as well, spirituality, spirit, and I'll come back to that a little bit in a second. But for me, all I'm pointing to when I speak about spirituality is, how do you relate to the big questions? Who am I? What am I here for? What makes me happy? What's my contribution? Those kinds of things. It's just like, how do you answer those for yourself? That for me is the level of spirituality. Now, whether that's the right word or not, I don't know. It comes from that Greek word, right? Spirare, breath. Inspiration, to breathe in, to breathe out, that kind of stuff. And so it is just related to breath, if you like. So it's almost like when I come back to that place of being, it's just what is it that kind of helps you go without the use of some kind of external aid.
It's such a beautiful definition. As we close out the episode, what are the things that we take away both from the Simon story, which he so generously shared, and also this conversation? And I would say, that point there around spirituality is a huge one for me. I also find myself thinking about my relationship with the hedonic treadmill. And I think it's a good one for any of us who are involved in, the perpetuation of capitalism in any way, shape or form, and all the things that brings with it, both for good and ill. I think it's a good one to meditate on and I'll certainly be meditating on, is my own relationship with the hedonic treadmill. And the other thing I found myself thinking about as we close out is that lovely distinction that you drew as well between doing and being. And actually, if we attend to our beingness, as it were, that's the thing that often needs attention, not more doing. And I find that really challenging in a very positive way as well. How about yourself?
What I took from Simon's story and the hedonic treadmill and all that is, so much of this is about value, and like the value we how we need to prove our own value. Well, if we come from the notion of love is allowing what is to be, that's actually as human beings and the more than human world as well, that we just have value just by virtue of being here. That's what being really means. It's just we're here, we're present, we're being, and we have value intrinsic in that. And there's that word as well, intrinsic. But so much of our setup in Western capitalism is based on proving our value. And actually, if I take anything from Simon's story of that kind of transcendence and coming back to attending to his being as he did through the active work of working the steps, but also, meditating, praying, taking care of himself, that's what enabled him to kind of come back to being much more in alignment with who he is and doing what, looks like incredible work in the world that that adds value. But that's because he's not busy trying to prove his value now.
Beautiful. I just in closing was reminded of a wonderful moment when I was doing my coaching qualifications and with a bunch of really, really high performing sort of exec types, and all of whom, by the way, had sort of colossal imposter syndrome, as often happens as adults when we're kind of retraining and stuff. And there's this just most wonderful supervisor of our small group. She's a terrific, just wonderful supervisor, beautiful human being, very congruent, as a model of congruence, actually. And we had a really challenging sort of supervision session with people in the group really struggling with their own imposter syndrome, she just asked this really beautiful question in closing. She just went, what if everybody in this group coached from a place of knowing that they were good enough? What would that make possible?
Perfect.
And I was like, and it honestly, it changed the whole dynamic of that group. It changed the entire learning journey of that group. It changed, I mean, it was literally as close to a perfect intervention as I've ever seen. And it comes from exactly the place that you're just talking to there. It was like, literally, if we just accepted that we were good enough in the first instance, what would that make possible? And I think Simon's story is exactly that, right? Exactly as you just said. If we just accepted that we were enough, what would that make possible? And talking to Simon and being sat in the studio with him and sort of hearing his story and seeing the piece that he's now at with it, which anybody watching this on video will, I think, really pick up on as well, and how that now flows into the work that he's done, the healing it's made possible with his ex-business partners, one of whom is now a business partner again, which is just
amazing.
An amazing story of reconciliation as well. I think is a beautiful sort of happy ever after, as it were, to that story. Krish, I wanted specifically you to join me on this second half of the episode, because I knew that given the nature of Simon's story, you'd have some beautiful and challenging reflections for us, and so it has proven. And so I just want to say a huge thank you for your time. We'll put links to your website and other very interesting stuff you've got going on around teaching, coaching, and all that kind of stuff in the show notes here. But yeah, just in closing, thank you ever so much for joining us today.
No, thanks for having me, Phil. It's been amazing.
A huge thanks there to Krish and also to Simon for sharing that story with us so openly and so generously. I hope you found as much value in it as I did. To which point, if you did find value in the episode, we would hugely appreciate it if you could leave us a rating or a review, share it with somebody that you think might also get value from it, or just hit that subscribe button below. Any and all support for what we're doing here is something we greatly appreciate. If you have any questions, you can contact me, phil@philhq.com. And in the meantime, I'll be back next month with another edition of the Phil Lewis Podcast. Bye for now.